We'd like to welcome you all and thank you very much for joining us. Just a few house rules before
recording in progress.
We'd like to ask that you all please keep your mics and videos off for the duration of the presentation. During the Q&A session, should you have any questions or comments, please lift up your hand or write in the chat box. We'd also just like to indicate that we will have a 35-minute presentation by Dr. Lewis, Olivia Lutz, and we'd like to ask that we also note that 25 minutes will be dedicated to the question and answer section. All right. Yes, and yeah, so that's all in terms of house rules. And in terms of today's presenters, we have Dr. Olivia Lutz, who will be presenting her some of the work that she has done for her PhD in visual studies. Okay, so I'll move on to introducing our speakers. Dr. Olivia Lutz. In her transdisciplinary research, Olivia Lewis focuses on how materialist readings of intersection between social and environmental justice in South Africa, on new materialist readings of the intersection between social and environmental justice in South Africa. She is particularly interested in the relationship between race and waste and aims to tease out the environmental and social benefits, challenges, and paradoxes of environmental initiatives in the Eastern Cape. She received her PhD in visual studies in 2022 from the University of Pretoria. Olivia is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in the research program at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy. Dr. Bibi Burger, who will be our moderator for today. Bibi Burger is a lecturer in Afrikaans literature at the University of Pretoria. She was a 2017 and 2018 ACLS African Humanities Program postdoctoral fellow and a 2021 short stay fellow at Ghent University's African program. She is currently an Isolomso fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, where she is doing research on the relationship between race and Afrikaans feminist literature. She is the book reviews editor at Tijdskrift vir Letterkunde, a journal for African literature. She is also a founding member of the Unlachering Collective, a group of lecturers attempting to rethink the ways in which Afrikaans literature and linguistics are taught. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Bibi, who would like to say a few words before we hand over to Dr. Lewis.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction and for having me. I'm sorry that I gave you all of those Afrikaans words to read. As the supervisor of Dr. Lewis's stellar thesis, Stuff, Matters and Moves, analyzing environmental consciousness and memory objects through a neo-materialist lens, I'm very much looking forward to this paper and the conversation afterwards. I think while Dr. Lewis is talking, you can already start, if a question comes to you, you can already type it in the chat box, but otherwise, please leave your questions for the Q&A afterwards. Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Lewis?
Thank you very much, Bibi. And thanks to everyone who is here today. I really appreciate it. And thanks also for the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy for giving me this opportunity to present some of the work that I've done. So I'll be sharing my screen with you. Can you see this?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Yes, so this is a webinar that I'm presenting on some of the work that I've done for my PhD. And specifically, this is a literature review that was mostly contained in chapter 3 of my thesis. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this. In November 2007, literary scholar Lawrence Buell delivered a paper entitled Environmental Memory and Planetary Survival. Speaking from within the discipline of literature studies, he noted that his lecture's hubristic title derived from an awareness of he considered to be a distinctly memoirish cast of environmental literature across the globe. Today, almost 15 years later, I open this webinar under very different social and environmental circumstances. Beale's lecture is the earliest source that I could find among those that referred to the discourses of memory and environmental degradation. At that stage, the term environmental memory was seldom employed and with no canonical usage. Beale mentioned that his work on environmental memory might offer an inter- and transdisciplinary perspective on environmental issues. Since 2007, an array of scholarly documents and projects have appeared. This research has been conducted mostly by researchers in the fields of memory studies and/or the environmental humanities, but occasionally also other disciplines and fields within the humanities, such as literature studies, trauma studies, animal studies, and cultural studies. These engagements were arguably sparked by the increasing currency of the term Anthropocene. From the ancient Greek word anthropos, meaning human, the Anthropocene is a term used to denote the current human-dominated geological epoch in which the Earth is rapidly transformed by extensive human activity. First and foremost, I acknowledge that the term Anthropocene can easily be read as universalist. All humans everywhere are responsible, and as reinforcing rather than dismantling anthropocentric worldviews. I use the term Anthropocene to refer to the rapid degradation of planet Earth as caused by considerable human activity, while remaining aware of these ambivalences. Taking a cue from the upsurge in writings on the topic, it can be argued, as memory scholar Steph Crabb notes, that we are currently witnessing the advent of a new fourth phase in memory studies. This phase, marked by a growing consciousness of the Anthropocene, takes a gradual scalar expansion that characterized the previous three phases of memory studies to a whole new level, or simply put, traveling memory on steroids. Increasing engagements with the Anthropocene also calls into question the humanist assumptions undergirding the previous three phases of memory studies. After several decades of intensive debate, it has become difficult to talk about environmental issues without evoking memories. This webinar focuses on the intersection between memory and the Anthropocene by referring to the existing literature. Over time, memory studies scholars have increasingly joined conversations around the Anthropocene that revolve around a knot of problems, as Lucy Bond, Ben de Bruyn, and Jessica Rapson refer to it. Remaining aware of the risk of what Astrid Earle calls writing to the moment, the theorists I refer to today do not claim to have answers, but often provide self-reflective suggestions for scholars of memory and environmental humanities by cross-fertilizing ideas and exchanging tools from various disciplines. Among other issues, these sources investigate how environmental degradation has introduced a multiplicity of new complexities into our thinking about time, history, and consciousness. It becomes clear that these writings increase the visibility of environmental issues through the generation of new interdisciplinary ideas. Today, I discuss the two most prominent threads that come to the fore in the literature. These include, firstly, an engagement with a radical recalibration of scale, or what environmental humanities scholar Timothy Clark calls a derangement of scale, and secondly, the unequal relationships between humans and other humans on the one hand, and humans and non-humans on the other hand. These threads tie in closely with fragmented and diverse memories of the past and imaginings of the future. This foregrounds theorists' plea that memory studies must expand its frames of reference while becoming less anthropocentric. There's consensus among theorists that the Anthropocene alters everything known about the human world and the way that it has functioned up until the current age. In particular, the Anthropocene, in Bond's words, enacts the demand to think of human life at much broader scales of space and time, while simultaneously acknowledging individual human and non-human experiences. In fact, as David Cronshaw contends, the reiteration of the problems of scale is becoming, I quote, something of a mantra. Due to such alterations in temporal and spatial scales, there's a general pull in the humanities towards a planetary perspective on the past, present, and future. This perspective requires new paradigms of critical inquiry that are able to address the lengthy prehistory of global warming, make visible the current geological impact of human activity, and imagine the various environmental futures that might constitute its afterlife. Cultural theorist Claire Colebrook agrees that acknowledging the Anthropocene implies acknowledging a reconfigured planet caused by humans by way of industrial, nuclear, colonizing, and plundering pasts. The Anthropocene, she argues, can be seen as an expansion of memory that takes us beyond our own humanness and towards a new memory where humans will have been an agent in a planetary shift that we only recognized after the event. Already, the Anthropocene is legible in the geological record that is being left by humanity's collective geophysical agency due to our profound impact on the planet. In fact, the very concept of the Anthropocene is premised on the idea that human existence will be discernible as a distinct geological layer. Cronshaw suggests that memory studies should refrain from demarcating what is remembered as a discrete and static object, since a variety of subjects across medial and non-human lines could and possibly should be considered in speaking about memory studies. These approaches could be informed by, for example, the study of geology as a key component of cultural understanding. Such altered spatial temporal parameters invite theorists to consider cultural memory in relation to what Pieter Vermeulen calls planetary storage systems, the atmosphere, the cryosphere, and the surface of the Earth, such as ice and rock strata. These colossal archives record and preserve the deep history of our species. Indeed, an undertone in many of these writings is the idea that the Earth, at the level of geology, is what Colebrook calls a subject of memory, records what is happening to it. From this perspective, the inscriptive event of the Anthropocene can be seen simply as an extension of the already existing archive of the Earth. These recordings could possibly be entangled with human memory and activity, but do not depend on them. The media of planetary memory thus stretch beyond the familiar forms of memorial culture, such as monuments and museums. Researchers must be conscious of alternative traces of human memory, such as carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and the chemical compositions of seas and soils. This suggests that memory studies is better equipped to handle unfathomable scales of change, such as those encountered in the Anthropocene, if it adapts its objects of memory, of study. As humans are confronted with new sensibilities in the face of rapid escalation of environmental issues, our thinking about time and memory becomes more complex. The Anthropocene's timeline is not that of European man, but of an Earth that will ultimately absorb human life. Sebastian Groos summarizes our ironic human perspective. Who is witnessing the archiving of human activity? Are we busying ourselves with memorializing ourselves? Thinking about it in this way is useful for memory studies in the Anthropocene due to the much needed focus on different forms of remembrance, in this case, terrestrial, as well as who is remembering and ultimately which Anthropocene is remembered. Being aware of this may add a new layer of understanding to memory, which exceeds human or collective memory and includes a much larger scale of subjects, including the Earth itself. Yet, while theorists are grappling with the reconciliation of massively increased senses of scale, or bumping up against philosopher Timothy Morton's hyper-objects, what is happening to individual memories on a minute scale? The increasing awareness of climatological memory, geological memory, and perhaps even cosmological memory dwarfs the individual embodied experience that is part of anthropocentric thinking. In his more recent work on the Anthropocene, published in 2015, Clarke also demonstrates ambivalences towards his initial suggestion of a derangement of scale, or at least how it might be achieved in theory and practice. He admits that the everyday practices by which we are habitually made sense of the world now have planetary implications, affecting a transpersonal agency that is mostly indiscernible at an individual level, but more apparent at a collective level. On the one hand, a terrifying weight of human numbers impacts the physical environment enormously, and on the other, we are unsure whether I, as the individual, matter. If I close the tap while I brush my teeth, if I have the privilege of a tap, clean water, and a toothbrush in the first place, does it make a difference? I turn briefly to the individual human body as a space of environmental memory. Astrida Neymanes and Rachel Walker hold that human bodies, or what they refer to as weather bodies, contract all past memories in the present moment in order to make sense of an experience. The body becomes alarmed by the remembered temporality of heat, cold, or seasons passings. The personal climate, or each individual's remembered weather, guides one's expectations of how weather should behave. Memories of weather accumulate throughout an individual's life and have an impact on how humans think about climate at any specific stage. Climate change and the fleshy, damp immediacy of our own embodied existences are intimately imbricated. Mike Hume therefore points out that memories, also those retold by previous generations of their childhood experiences, become our normative yet highly malleable guide to present and future weather. This awkward contradiction between the individual and the collective is one of the most dislocating effects of climate change. Before I move on to thread 2, I conclude the present thread. Theorists argue for large-scale thinking without losing sight of the smaller, more detailed picture. When this happens, particular sufferings, the unequal distribution of violence, and the intersections of global upheaval and personal trauma might be overlooked. The scale and materiality of the emerging catastrophic environmental processes demand of memory studies a truly transdisciplinary approach. The challenge here is to keep the familiar alongside the planetary in the articulation of catastrophe. Environmental futures need to be framed as a negotiation between expansion and contraction to give both ends of the scale meaning in relation to each other. I now move to the closely related theme of inequality and consequently agency, with which memory theorists are increasingly confronted in the Anthropocene. To tease out possible ways forward, it is necessary to take into account the existing societal and spatial structures of the 21st century. It is common knowledge that parts of the planet and its local humans, fauna, and flora feel the devastating effects of environmental degradation more than others. This inequality, most notably between the global north and the global south, is continuously present due to long histories of oppression, colonialism, and discrimination. Further, environmental issues evidently intertwine with social issues, such as those of class, race, and gender. The Anthropocene, a product of, in quotations, Western humans, is frequently accused of obscuring inequalities in the global distribution of responsibility for environmental degradation, because the term, according to Leslie Green, founding director of Environmental Humanities South at the University of Cape Town, unfairly lumps together the human race as a whole. The fact that the poor are least to blame but suffer the most is obscured from view by the Anthropocene narratives driven by a species-level understanding of the human. Moreover, the global south often relies on extractive mining economies and recycling initiatives that happen at a cost to human lives and general environmental health of that space. The toxins and waste associated with such capitalist practices simultaneously cause illness in the bodies of laborers and irrevocable toxic environmental changes. In her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, Catherine Yusof proposes the concept of Black Anthropocenes to name the many voidings of marginalized experiences. Yusof argues further that the sudden concern about exposures of environmental harms brought about in the Anthropocene simply marks the exposure of white liberal communities to these. For centuries, environmental issues have knowingly been exported to Black and brown communities under the rubric of civilization, progress, modernization, and capitalism. The association of Black and brown working bodies with waste, recycling, and mining labor continues even today. The material processes and grammars used to describe and uphold environmentalism thus perpetually instill anti-Blackness. Memories, also environmental memories, are visibly fragmented along these spatial and racial lines. As Heather David notes, living in a place such as Wenan in China, which after 25 years of operating as a plastics recycling village, is effectively a dead zone with pervasive negative health effects for the population and local ecology, would impact one's memory in ways unimaginable to those not in that position. Here, waste is sifted, filtered through, and recognized for its worth by those who cannot afford to participate in the throwaway culture that brought about the waste in the first place. These divergent experiences bring about radically different affective memories. Environmental humanities scholar Rob Nixon claims that the discounted human and ecological casualties that result from war's toxic aftermath, or climate change, or simply long dyings, are underrepresented in human memory. Moreover, because the primary texts of fields such as memory studies or trauma studies marginalize or completely ignore the trauma suffered by members of non-Western and minority groups, traumatic memories of events such as the deep scars left by slavery and colonialism, the catastrophic experimentations of communism and socialism, the shrinking of the RLC since the 1960s, the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl in 1986, continued racism, and the dark underbelly of China's Industrial Revolution are often obscured or left undocumented. As a result, the foundations of memory studies risk perpetuating the very beliefs and structures that underlie existing inequalities and injustices instead of challenging them. Nixon's concept of slow violence gives some perspective in this regard. Slow violence, generally generated by global capitalism, can be seen as, I quote, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Nixon explains that the one way in which slow violence happens is when rich nation toxins are dumped onto the world's poorest continent, Africa, most notably since the 1990s. This skewed relationship is aggravated by rich nation environmentalists who campaign against industrial waste and garbage dumps condemned as health threats and as aesthetically offensive in their own countries. Elite environmental movements, who are supposed to deal sufficiently with such global matters, simply pass on the problem. Jennifer Wenzel argues that addressing inequalities of race, class, and genders is a main concern for the Anthropocene discourse. She finds it problematic that the current fascination with these big, new, shiny, scary objects, the deep past and the deep future, trump more mundane questions of the present, of inequality and of justice, which tend to fall through the cracks or be forgotten. Precisely such factors link the Anthropocene and memory. Human memories are shaped by lived experiences that are inseparable from gender, class, and race. To emphasize these linkages in future writings, post-colonial and non-Western perspectives must be included to avoid reinforcing marginalizing systemic structures of inequality. According to Wenzel, the modifications of historical time at work in the Anthropocene can be read as an uncanny inversion of colonial-era developmentalist progress narratives. As part of the imperialist and colonial projects, the West offered the rest of the world a carefully constructed image of its own future. The Anthropocene echoes an ironic inverse colonial fear that an ominous third world present offers an image of the first world's future. Wenzel proposes thinking with terms such as past's futures and future's pasts. These two terms encapsulate the entanglements of anticipation and retrospection. On the one hand, past's futures connotes how people in the past imagine the future would be, and on the other hand, future's pasts entails what has to have happened before the future arrives. This emerging mode of thinking in the Anthropocene offers a dark future anterior in which third world problems will have arrived in the first world. Yet, for many around the globe, this dark future anterior is, and has been for quite some time, a stark reality. Similarly, Kohlberg's term of preliminary mourning also point out how future's pasts are constructed. Grieving over an anticipated extinction of humanity under the conditions of the Anthropocene means grieving over the past prior to a fragile, drowned, or lost world, and so of what once made us human. In effect, preliminary mourning remembers past representations of the environment. Against this sketch of the current state of affairs between humans, I turn to the unequal relationships between humans and non-humans that theorists are increasingly aiming to unravel in the 21st century. Although with greater emphasis on some or the other objective, new materialists, among other non- and post-human theorists, have called for revised models of agency and accountability that extend beyond the human. Such contemporary philosophies reject anthropocentrism, the privileging of human existence, and shift the focus from the autonomous human experience of things to the interconnectedness of things. Anthropocentric discourses in which Western humans are the exceptional species and the measure against which life is understood is rooted in the onset of modernity that was structured by discrete dichotomous thinking. Humanity's failure to adequately address environmental problems can be read as a symptom of the struggle for the domination of nature with a capital N, made possible through enlightenment. The false dichotomy between nature and culture is a Eurocentric construction that was inherited from Romanticism. It was further perpetuated by modernism and upheld by capitalist ideologies. This construct is coming undone in the Anthropocene. If there can be something like climate change, it is not because humans no longer live in harmony with nature, but precisely because there's no nature that can be bereaved or restored. In several ways then, as Bond argues, the Anthropocene might be considered to evoke a crisis of mourning, not only because of the challenges it poses to established regimes, but also because the object of mourning is fundamentally opaque. Theorists are increasingly calling for a series of shifts, such as an erosion of human exceptionalism and a break in the assumption that only some human fates matter and that they matter more than those of non-humans. They agree that truly ecological approaches will value the interactions between materialities. Memory theorist Anne Rigney argues that such ecologically adapted approaches would imply theoretical and methodological innovation, increasingly including a dynamic interplay of persons, objects, and creatures as our object of research. Roseanne Kennedy points out that a pressing challenge for the memory studies and environmental humanities more broadly. She questions how its current resources and tools would push the field beyond its anthropocentric focus to incorporate non-human species as objects, if not subjects, of memory. To this end, memory critics could begin by extending their objects to include the memory of non-human species. Although Krapps views the suggestion as an enriching and potentially useful response to environmental issues, he warns that working solely with radical methodologies threatens to discount the human subject, or in his words, throwing the human baby out with the anthropocentric bathwater. Because phrasing and rhetoric impact the way we think about a certain notion, it is further important to situate the words currently used to describe the Anthropocene, including those suggested to describe it. To illustrate this, I briefly referred to the popular strategy for deploying memory as a basis for advocacy for environmental change, the overused metaphor of the Holocaust. Theorists, including influential figures such as climate scientist Walter Dodds, uses such a rhetoric of guilt, implying that the threat of extinction can be read as an ecological Holocaust. The Holocaust, assumed to be an unparalleled symbol of universal evil, serves in theory as a moral imperative to foster action against atrocities in the present. However, it is important to point out how this approach is problematic in at least two ways. Firstly, it must be acknowledged that a Western understanding of trauma continues to privilege genocide of Europeans, particularly the Holocaust in its various forms, over non-European genocides and the genocidal over other slower structural forms of violence experienced in colonial and post-colonial scenarios. Therefore, one of memory studies' central tasks, which has been to remember the victims of precisely these forms of violence and exclusion, also in order to prevent them from happening again, may be at odds not only with the calls to decolonization, but also with the humanist foundation of the field, which has, until now, gone almost unquestioned. Secondly, it is problematic that the metaphorical use of the Holocaust reduces tangible tragedies and traumas to rhetoric. Thus, extending the logic of the Holocaust to the threat of species extinction.
Sorry, please make sure that you're muted. Thank you.
Thus, extending the logic of the Holocaust to the threat of species extinction demonstrates the unsettling ways in which memory paradigms shape moral discourses and advocacy in the present. Kennedy holds that the field of memory studies has yet to engage significantly with the loss of non-human species, especially without strategically using the Holocaust as a rhetorical device. Yet, the other end of the spectrum is just as important. Conceiving memory in strictly non-human terms, free from human modes of experience and representation, might risk making memory, as Krapps notes, a mere metaphor. It therefore remains important to question whether it is indeed possible or necessary to think about memory or the planetary outside the anthropocentric modes of representation and cognition. Vermeulen suggests returning to existing anthropocentric memory banks to tease out the stories told by modern archives in order to remember modernity differently. Modernity can be read as an anxious effort to police the borders between the human and the non-human, and as a tedious balancing act between human agency and the forces and afflictions that assault it. Precisely because human accounts are contingent and open to revision, returning to the point of modernity could yield fresh perspectives on current problems. The Anthropocene poses questions about the place and the role of humanity, which consists of diverse humans with diverse lived experiences entangled in the world around them. While paying attention to the exposure of non-humans to environmental catastrophes, animal studies theorist Kerry Whale suggests equally exploring the extent to which some humans are responsible, even if such loss was not planned or foreseen. In the end, as Kennedy notes, one of the main drivers of memory studies becomes the issue of value. What stories are being told, by whom, and for what end? In conclusion, memory studies and Anthropocene discourses are progressively approached from an interdisciplinary perspective, also in relation to one another. I here aimed to provide a holistic overview of the literature on the intersection between memory and the Anthropocene. In the first instance, memory studies needs to critically engage with a recalibration of scale, including renewed understandings of Anthropocene, time, and space. While grappling with massive spatial temporal scales, scholars should not lose sight of individual experience that continue to shape micropolitics of the self. This led to the second prominent thread. In order for a more just future to materialize, memory theorists agree that the field needs to start thinking ecologically rather than merely socially. This involves a break with the persistent humanism that has thus far prevented the field from adequately addressing the vast spatial temporal magnitudes of the Anthropocene. While arguing that anthropocentrism should be replaced with greater engagement with the non-human, theorists hold that this should not nullify engagement with unjust and detrimental realities that many, if not most, human and non-human populations are currently facing. Together, these threads provide insights into how memory transforms the Anthropocene and how the Anthropocene transforms memory and what the effects of these transformations are. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for that beautiful paper illustrating the value of thinking together environmental consciousness and memory studies. Okay, so we have about 25 minutes for questions, or maybe a little bit more. If you have a question, please put up your hand or type. I think while we wait for some questions to accumulate, I'll ask the question of my own. I think this is very self-centered, I'm bringing it back to my own research, but something underlying your research is also the idea of the relationship between the human and space, as you know, thinking of environment in that sense, being recalibrated or rethought. So I was wondering what effect space, in the sense of living in Pretoria and then now living in Quebec, has that had on your thoughts on one, environmentalism, and two, memory studies and the intersection between the two?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think also because you have just moved away from Pretoria after having been there for quite some time, so I think this could actually be a really interesting conversation. I think one of the main things is, and we've spoken a lot about this at CANRAD, is in South Africa, we have these nodes of knowledge, which is mostly centered around Gauteng and Cape Town. And there's very little that you find research and researchers from other provinces. And I think a lot is being done, but these spaces are not being discussed as broadly as they could be. So for me, I think it's very exciting to find myself in a new space, to be faced with other kinds of environmental challenges. Being close to the ocean now, the advertisements are different. The way that people engage with the space is different. We have a looming day zero in Quebeca that I was not even aware of before I moved here, and everyone knew about the day zero in Cape Town. So these kinds of very specific spatial issues is something that has really struck me over the past few months. So there's definitely a massive shift. We are also, the quality of the water is so bad, we have to buy bottled water, which brings about other questions of the environmental impact of purchasing a bottle of water wrapped in plastic, that plastic going into your body going into the environment. So I've definitely been faced with other kinds of challenges and thought processes, having moved from Pretoria to the coastal area. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I look forward to seeing where this takes you, how this new environment will shape your research. I see in the chat, Giovanni Poggi, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, made a statement. He said, I find this conversation very similar to geocentrism versus heliocentrism. In the ancient past, humans were so arrogant that they couldn't imagine that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Galileo was persecuted for proposing heliocentrism, which is correct. The sun is the center of our universe. There's an arrogance in anthropocentrism as well. Fundamentally, we are part of the Earth. The Earth doesn't exist for our irresponsible exploitation. If we were to suddenly die out, the Earth would move on without us. We need a mindset change. I think you already addressed this, but do you want to respond to this question?
Yeah, I think actually, I mean, this is something that everyone in the environmental humanities is grappling with. So this term of the Anthropocene was put forward to explain that humans' impact on the environment is so massive that we have to have this shift in the way we think. But in doing that, we assert the human once again at the center of it. So it's been interesting to see the kinds of permutations of the Anthropocene that people have presented. So instead of saying Anthropocene, people would say Manthropocene to say that it's part of a patriarchal system, or Capitalocene, so it's capitalism that has brought about this. And I did touch on this in the talk because I think it's really important to take note of the problematics of this term, and that they could be rectified. None of these other terms have caught on, especially I think of like Donna Haraway. She also suggested, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but I think it's Cthulhucene, which is this interaction between creatures of the earth, and we are also creatures of the earth. We are one of the species that exist on this planet. So my hope is that one day we would find new words and make new vocabularies to speak about these issues that do not put the human at the center of the problem. Because it is, as Giovanni said, the world will exist without us. It will go on. When we are extinct, the planet will continue to live and will continue to change.
Absolutely. Any more questions or comments? Professor Christy van der Westhuizen.
I'm trying to start my video. Right. Yes, that has been, thank you so much, Bibi, and thank you so much, Olivia. That has been a very wide-ranging and all-encompassing, not all-encompassing, but quite, wide-ranging is probably a better word, discussion of the problematics around the Anthropocene. I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think you've really brought us into the literature on this question and also the problematization of it. When I was at UCT about 10 years ago, there was great excitement about the whole, the use of the concept, and then the excitement almost reminded one of that kind of typical, a kind of a feeling that you associate actually with the Enlightenment or modernist approach to life. It's almost like, we've made another great jump forward, with with this concept. Progress is happening, in academia, and so on. Which, of course, the concept is meant to problematize the centrality of human development at the cost of all other beings on the planet, and it's supposed to be problematizing the Enlightenment view of what counts as human life and human development, and so forth. And but it was so eagerly embraced and touted as a wonderful sign of intellectual progress, and so on. So there's that kind of. So it's very good to hear about the problematization of the term and the reinterpretation from different vantage points, also in the global South and from the African point of view. And thank you so much for that. I've really enjoyed this. And I think it's a very rich talk, and there's much to pick over and try and understand. You did make a comment about the dark side of China's development at the moment, and of course a typical response would be from the point of view of the global South that right now, when the global South is making some advances towards economic development, which is necessary for human development, at this very moment, from the North, you get a concept like the Anthropocene, which is supposed to be problematizing exactly this kind of progress that's needed for the global South to lift its peoples, out of poverty and so on. So, do you want to comment on that, perhaps? Just how one would respond to that kind of criticism that would suggest that the possibility of economic development and human development with it is being snatched away from the global South through these kinds of problematizations, where environmental concerns are actually now being used to undermine the global South in its quest of developing its peoples and so forth. That would be the one thing. And then the other thing is, I found your discussion about the concept of ecological holocaust very interesting, actually. And it is true that we as human beings, we do have a tendency to go for kind of a shorthand kind of reference. We like to use certain buzzwords, one could almost say, not to diminish, of course, what the Holocaust is denoting, but we do tend to perhaps be a bit lazy in terms of our concepts to try and capture something properly. But I have to also say that I take the point around the privileging of a genocide of European people over non-European genocides, and of course, one immediately it comes to mind that while before the genocide of Jewish people that came to be known as the Holocaust in Europe, we had several colonial genocides in the Latin American context, in our own context here in what became South Africa, but also across our own continent, and so forth. We know also that the Nazis, in a sense, there was a test run for the genocide of Jewish people in the form of the Nama genocide in Namibia, or the genocide of Namibian people in the then German Southwest Africa. So we do know that, but of course there would be a criticism around that. In a sense, if you think about the Holocaust, it was actually Europeans, people who saw themselves as Europeans, Germans who had an idea of race around, the superiority of the Aryan race, that these were Europeans basically lashing out at Jewish people as not properly European then.
Okay. Yes.
And because anti-Semitism ultimately, so it's actually about it's a form of racism it's still with us. It historically and still in contemporary forms. It's actually about denying Jewish people actually full humanity in that sense, and definitely also denying their Europeanness. I think for the Nazis, the Jewish people were actually interlopers and a threat to European civilization and European race purity, as conceptualized through the whole idea of Aryanism. So with that, for me, I would actually, in that sense, problematize the idea that the Holocaust was strictly speaking a genocide of European people, because in a sense it was actually exactly lashing out at Jewish people for not being regarded actually as European, and actually a threat to European oneness. And which is something that had been coming over centuries, as we know. So the persecution of Jewish people has got a long also history over millennia, with constant expulsions and persecutions of Jewish people in European context where they're not actually being accepted. So I thought I'll just maybe comment on. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thanks very much, Christy. So I think I'll quickly speak to this because it is interesting, and as you say, there's a long history of prosecutions of Jewish people, and I think if I think about it now, I'd probably rephrase it in the sense that it is the specific genocide places a lot of emphasis on who the perpetrators are, and the perpetrators are the Europeans. The Germans in this case. So it's still being foregrounded above other forms of genocide. If you think of the Rwandan genocide, who were between two groups of people within the country, although it was brought about by the impact of colonialism from from European countries, it was still among two groups within that space, within that specific country. So I think the thing that I would want to add in that sense is that there's still probably a privileging of the atrocities that were brought about by Europeans, and that Europeans should keep themselves in check in that sense, and that will still be used to make sure that everyone across the globe do not let this happen again. That I think that is something that I would add, that there's a lot, it has a lot to do with the perpetrator in this sense. So that's the one thing. On your other question, that's actually a very interesting topic in South Africa, especially because of our specific history. There's a great divide in South Africa between environmental and social issues, where in fact these intertwine the whole time. Issues of housing is not only a social issue, it's also an environmental issue. It's issues of having access to water and health facilities and these kinds of aspects. It's both environmental and social. And Catherine Yusuf has actually written a lot about specifically this Western push now towards taking care of the environment and doing activism for the environment and for the environment's sake. And in that sense, people who've been previously disadvantaged now do not even have the opportunity for their own economic growth because they are still left out of the picture. And there was for a very long time, since the establishment of colonialism, there was this forced alliance actually between nature and humans of color, non-white humans. And that forced alliance is basically, it never gave these groups of communities the opportunity to be fully human. They were regarded also as non-human. And now the next step is, the next fancy thing to do is to look at the environment, the non-human, but then I've been associated with the non-human for such a long time, for centuries. And now we are looking at the non-human, but I'm from my human perspective. So it is a very difficult question, and I do think there is a gap in providing people the space to speak about the human experience and the human past. And that was one of the things that I would hope to also communicate in this talk, is we cannot just say, okay, we are speaking about the non-human now, and that's the only thing that we are doing. There has to be a discussion of all these different levels so that people have the opportunity to have their say within the broader context.
Thanks for that. I see there's some more questions in the chat.
Yes, Tolofelo asks a question which I think is very much related. How do you see this in relation to people in the developing countries destroying the environment to fulfill the need to belong by taking up space on Earth?
I just see this in relation to people in developing countries destroying the environment. Is this person saying that people in developing countries are destroying the earth so that they can belong to the earth?
Yes, I think maybe in terms of fitting into Western global narratives of progress.
Okay, I see.
I don't want to speak for them. They can elaborate. Yeah, you can speak.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking, and does tie into what I've just said, is.
Oh, sorry, I meant Cholofelo so they can elaborate on the question if they want.
Yes, hi. Yes,
hi,
I believe
guys.
that you've answered part of my question. I think we had the same thought process. And mine was more in relation to history, because imperialism and colonialism has taken away Black people's history. And now when they want to, like in relation to memory, when they try to put themselves within history by maybe having statues and all of that, because I see that happening a lot, where people are, especially in relation to our history in SA, where people are maybe erecting statues in order for them to fit into this kind of capitalistic history. So how do you feel about that? And it was also in relation to housing, where by people need places to live, but then when they do want to, let's say, go to a space where there are no buildings and they want to live there, then it's considered an issue. And yeah, so that's why I'm saying that you've answered part of my question really. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that.
Okay, another question from China Chetty from YouTube. What are the implications for how we relate to other sentient beings? What about ecocide, destruction of species, and torture of other species?
Yeah, so this is something that, especially from an animal studies perspective, a lot of theorists are grappling with, because it is so that humans are aware of what they are doing, but in many cases this was not foreseen. It was never on purpose that humans decided we are now going to make sure that all of these species around us become extinct. I don't think of humans in that way, and I don't think that was the goal ever. But it is necessary to think about these kinds of ecocides because it does have a profound impact not only on that specific species, but also on the human species and how we will evolve if we think about all of the pollution in the oceans. And so many diets, human diets, come from the ocean, and we are essentially eating plastic. And that is not to say that we should care about this because it has an effect on us, but it does have an effect on us. And people should take note of this. And they should, according to me at least, people should be kept in check. To make sure, if you think about the cosmetics industry and a lot of farming facilities and these kind of things, species are being tortured for humans to gain in a capitalist sense. So definitely work needs to be done on that. In my research, I did find Some theorists who do actually advocate for this, and they work very hard to make sure that people are aware of this. I mean, it does form part of the environmental humanities. I do think it will become increasingly important in the years to come.
While we wait for other questions, maybe this is an unfair question, Olivia, but when you say humans should be kept in check, what do you have in mind?
Yeah, that's difficult. I think the thing that I think about first is the people in positions to make certain concepts, to communicate certain concepts, need to do that. They should if there's an awareness of a problem, then people should speak about that problem and speak not only to the people who agree with them, but also the people who disagree with them, because the environmental issue is very broad and very complex, and there are so many different perspectives. And I think there's a responsibility. I think that's kind of the word that I'm looking for, a responsibility to cast new words, to create new vocabularies and new ways of thinking about these issues. And in that sense, checking up on one another, saying, hey, what are you saying when you say that? What do you mean? And I think that, in a sense, for me, is what I mean when I say that people have to take accountability and hold other people accountable for the way that we speak about the issues around us.
Yeah, that brings up a lot of interesting thoughts again about our interrelationality with other humans. And I start thinking about your position at the Center for Advancements of Non-Racialism at Democracy, and how democracy and communication, looking at it from a pragmatics point of view, how do we communicate these issues? Sorry, I'm just thinking aloud. I don't have any.
Yeah, no, we were speaking about this, Nhlakanipo and I. So one of my colleagues at the center, Nhlakanipo, whom we've met. What does that mean when we say non-racialism? We had a massive conference last year hosted by Nelson Mandela University surrounding democracy, and it was fascinating to see the many different perspectives on not only the concept, but also the term. When we hear the word, what do we think about? And there's a lot going on in that thought process. So it is really important to tease out what we mean when we use a certain word. And in suggesting new words, we have to think about the consequences of these words.
That ties up very nicely again with the paper about the Anthropocene. Prof. Anaristaise, Christy.
Hi, thank you. I was just thinking of something else around, because you were saying, Olivia, that you think that the extinction that we've caused as human beings has been unintentional. But I don't know if I completely agree, because if you look at particularly colonial violence, we know, of course, that a lot of the colonial violence was exacted against indigenous people, on our continent and also on other, like in Latin America and so forth. But you also see incredible violence against the environment, non-human beings around the colonials, and massive, particularly assisted, of course, through the machinery of weapons. Mm-hmm. So with weaponry, became possible to kill at much larger scale. And it's interesting if you look at, for example, at images that I found of British settlers going hunting, in the Eastern Cape. So after the settlement of Port Elizabeth, and roaming inland to go hunting, and then posing with an incredible number of, you can't believe, like mounds and mounds and mounds of buck that have been shot. The posing with your large, your elephant, etc., etc. I came across a song, something like "Aho, aho, off to Addo, we go hunting. Because for the British, actually, interestingly, in terms of the British way of looking at the world, it's all about sport. And so hunting it's about sportsmanship. But of course, there's an incredible amount of objectification that goes with it. So, because these are sentient beings that you are basically attacking and killing in the name of sport and sportsmanship and so forth. And it's just the scale of it. So if you think about it, across South Africa, you get the name Seekoevlei. So and this basically means to non-Afrikaans speakers that it's a wetland where you used to find hippopotamus. So that's what Seekoe is in Afrikaans. So we've got all these Seekoevlei wherever you go. I'm always astonished when I'm driving around and here's another Seekoevlei and there's another Seekoevlei and so forth. So, but those were actually named after actual pools of, in rivers where you did find hippos at the time. There was mass shootings of these hippos, killing of the hippos. You come across names like a tiger, which is the Dutch didn't actually know that they weren't looking at tigers, they were actually looking at leopards and so on. But that's actually, again, Tigervallei here in Cape Town, again, obviously you had incredible numbers of leopard and of lion, etc., all eviscerated. So I do think that there's a kind of a death drive that comes out of the objectification of nature that you were talking about so eloquently. The objectification is this whole thing of dominating nature and objectifying it and making it available for whatever ways and means that humans see fit. Given that, so there's also that biblical link, God appointing human beings over its creation to make and break as they see fit, particularly white men from the West. So I just wanted to throw that in the pot.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, I think for me that there's two parts here. So I think the one thing is I completely agree with you. This idea of entertaining the self with weapons and going out and dominating a creature that does not have the same tools as you in that moment. So going out shooting an elephant. There's definitely that entertainment aspect that has amplified the idea of nature as this object that we can just use and abuse for our pleasure. So I completely agree with that. And the other thing that you mentioned about people chasing away or making sure that their area is free of whatever they do not want to be there, whether it be other humans or whether it be animals, other sentient beings that they do not want in that area. For me, that's a question of territory. So this is my space, and I'm going to do in my space what I want to do in my space. There's not necessarily the end goal of extincting all of those creatures from that group in that species on the entire planet. It's basically just me in my little corner, and I'm keeping it safe, and I'm making sure that it's free from pests or whatever I do not want inside my space. So I think there's something in that for me, that it's not necessarily, the end goal is not to extinct all of that kind all over the planet. It's on a much smaller scale. When linked with entertainment and pleasure of doing certain acts, it is interesting, but I do still think that it's a small scale endeavor.
Thanks for that. I see there's a question from Erin.
Yes, thank you, Olivia. I think that brings us back to the difficulty of the environmental consciousness, that nobody means to destroy the world, but we have come to this point. Erin asked, and I think this should be the last question, I was wondering, how do you reconcile the concepts of mourning or remembering past states of the environment without an overly romanticized sense of nostalgia? And then she talks about the value that technology has in certain ways, and we are all in different parts of the world talking about this together. How do you propose we move forward in a manner that does not sacrifice or deny how far we've come technologically, while preserving and maintaining that what we can of the natural environment?
Sure. Yeah, when you throw technology into the mix, it's a whole new discussion actually, because I have, I mean, it's a double-edged sword in a sense, that it's very good to have these systems in place that people are able to communicate natural disasters and new ideas and new ways of seeing through technology. But technology also has a massive environmental impact. Yeah, so it's once again, it's like you say, there is this idea of the past as this sublime and clear and pure space that we have now come and screwed up. That was it is the case, but it's also not the case, and that ties in with me to theorists and scholars having the responsibility to speak about humans and nature as one and the same thing. We are not apart from nature. And although it seems like technology is this human-made thing, it's so tightly intertwined with the environment, extracting all of the materials that are needed to make sure that the internet is kept afloat. It's an environmental issue as well, and it's all of that ties in together. So we do have a responsibility to not have this idea of, this lost nostalgic past that we once had. Let's return to that, because there's no way. It cannot happen. It's like I said in my talk, it's fundamentally opaque, this object that we are mourning that comes from the past. So I think there are some interesting times ahead in terms of how we will start thinking about, or how the world will start thinking about nature and humans and technology, and how all of that is intertwined.
Thank you, Olivia. We've now come to the end of our time. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you everyone for your questions and for participating in the conversation. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Christy van der Westhuizen, the head of the research program at CANRAD, the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So it's just left over to me to thank everybody for making the time to join us today. I know that we're all completely sick of screens, so I do think it's a testimony to the importance and also the fascination that I think this topic brings to us. You know, I want to thank Dr. Lutz for presenting this to us today, because it does bring us into the complexity of the not just the human condition, but the planetary condition at the moment. And I do like the skillful way in which you have brought all these different concerns, from the environmental dimension, but also very clearly into the social dimension. Actually, also showed that it's a false dichotomy to place the environment over here and human society over here. And in fact, that is part of the kind of Western binary thinking that we need to overcome if we also want to properly address the dilemmas that the Anthropocene age presents to us. So I want to really thank you so much, Olivia, for a wonderful presentation. And I want to thank Dr. Bibi Berger from the University of Pretoria, currently actually a fellow at STIAS at Stellenbosch, also for your participation today and your contribution, much appreciated. Dr. Berger was the supervisor on Olivia's dissertation, from which is partly where this presentation today was drawn from. So wonderful work. I'm really looking forward to the rest of what will come out of the dissertation. So congratulations to both of you for the wonderful work done here. And then I also want to thank our team, Mhlakanipo Mhlongo, who opened proceedings for us today. Thank you so much, Mhlakanipo. And then behind the scenes, our other postdoctoral research fellow at the research program, Dr. Olutubi Akingbade. And then Lesego Nkosi, our research and engagement intern, who's also been helping behind the scenes. And thank you to all of you for pulling this together and making this a successful event. Thank you to our audience again for being with us today. And yeah, if you are subscribed to our email list, do look out for future events. And yeah, have a lovely rest of the day.
Thanks.